George Dawson was adjusting his grandson's rusty bike chain when a military convoy suddenly stopped in front of his house. Armed men got out without a word and ordered that he be taken away. During the silent ride to the base, a single word hung in the air: traitor. But no one there had any idea that George was hiding a secret powerful enough to silence the very colonel who was accusing him. The military base loomed on the horizon like a fortress of concrete and barbed wire. George Dawson watched through the armored windows of the military vehicle as they passed through the security gates, each checkpoint more severe than the last. At 82, his calloused hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a growing sense of restrained indignation as they neared their destination. The soldiers escorting him remained completely silent, following procedures George knew all too well. Decades had passed since he last stepped inside a military facility, but the protocols were still etched into his memory like invisible scars. The vehicle stopped in front of a red brick building. Two soldiers got out first, scanning the surroundings with precise, calculated movements. Only then did they open the door for George. He stepped out slowly, his arthritis protesting against the cold morning. "Right this way, sir," one of the soldiers said, motioning toward the main entrance. George noticed the forced respect in their tone. They still called him sir, but their weapons stayed at the ready. Inside, narrow hallways stretched in every direction, marked by numbered doors and metal signs. George was led up to the third floor, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the worn floor. The interrogation room was exactly as he remembered. A single table in the center, two chairs, a bright lamp hanging from the ceiling, and a one-way mirror covering half of the side wall. Nothing had changed. "Sit down," one of the soldiers ordered, pointing to the chair on one side of the table. George complied silently, folding his hands in his lap as he waited. His eyes scanned every detail of the room, instinctively mapping exits and observation points. Old habits never really die. 15 minutes passed before the door opened again. A middle-aged man entered with firm steps, his uniform displaying the insignia of a colonel. Close-cropped gray hair, a square jaw, and steel-gray eyes that looked like they could cut through metal. This was clearly the man behind his arrest. "Colonel Adams," he introduced himself curtly, yanking out the chair across from George with unnecessary force. The scrape of metal on the floor cut through the silence like a blade. "Commander of Internal Security for this base." George gave a respectful nod. "George Dawson, sir." "I know exactly who you are, Dawson," Adams replied, opening a thick folder stuffed with documents. "Former Army captain, served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970, awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, retired after 40 years of service." "Correct, sir." Adams flipped through the papers slowly, each motion deliberately theatrical. "I also know you worked on classified projects during your final 5 years of service. Projects that are still top secret to this day." George didn't move, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. This conversation was taking a turn he hadn't expected. "In the past 6 weeks," Adams continued, "we've detected leaks of highly sensitive information related to Delta operations from the 1980s. Information known only to a handful of living individuals." He slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "You're one of those individuals, Dawson." "With all due respect, Colonel, I have no idea what you're talking about." Adams leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Lies, Dawson, bold-faced lies." His voice rose, full of accusation. "You sold classified information to foreign journalists. Documents about operations that were never meant to see daylight." George felt his face flush. Decades of complete silence, guarding secrets that could ruin careers and threaten national security. And now this colonel was calling him a traitor? "I have never broken my oath of secrecy," George said, his voice low but steady. "Never." Adams slammed his fist on the table. "The truth is, you're a traitor, Dawson. A damn traitor selling out your own country." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. George looked at the colonel with eyes that had seen far more than this man could ever imagine. Slowly, a decision took shape in his mind. A decision that would change the entire course of this investigation. George Dawson leaned slightly forward, his eyes never leaving Colonel Adams's rage-flushed face. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Only the low hum of the air conditioner filled the space between the two men. Then, in a whisper so faint that Adams had to lean in to hear it, George spoke the words that would change everything. Tombstone Delta 9. The effect was instant and devastating. The color drained from the colonel's face like water pouring from a cracked tank. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and he pushed back from the table as if the devil himself had just whispered his true name. What? What did you say? Adams stammered, his once commanding voice now reduced to a trembling whisper. George didn't repeat himself. He simply leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and watched as the colonel struggled to process what he'd just heard. Tombstone Delta 9 wasn't just a code. It was an ultra-classified key. Only a select few people on Earth even knew it existed. Adams shot to his feet, knocking over his chair in the process. The sound of metal crashing to the floor echoed through the room. "You two, out, now!" he barked at the guards by the door. The soldiers exchanged confused glances but obeyed immediately. Once they were alone, Adams rushed to a red phone mounted on the wall, a direct line George recognized as a top-level emergency channel. The colonel dialed a short code, his hands visibly shaking. "This is Adams, code red. I need to speak with General Harrison immediately." "I don't care if he's in a meeting with the Secretary of Defense. Get him, now." George watched the colonel's growing panic with a calm born of decades spent in high-stakes situations. He had bet everything on that code, knowing there were only two possible outcomes. Either Adams had no idea what it meant, proving his unfitness to lead this investigation, or he did, and realized the magnitude of his mistake. Clearly it was the second. "General Harrison, this is Colonel Adams. Sir, we have a complicated situation. I have a man in custody under investigation for treason who just said the words, Tombstone Delta 9. The silence on the other end of the line was so deep, even George could feel it. "Yes, sir. Tombstone Delta 9. His name is George Dawson." Adams stopped speaking, clearly cut off by a barrage of words from the general. The next 5 minutes were a steady stream of "yes, sir" and "understood, sir," as Adams received what were obviously very specific and very urgent orders. When he finally hung up, his face was ghost pale. "General Harrison is on his way here," Adams muttered. George gave a calm nod. "I figured he would be." You can't be here by coincidence," Adams continued, pacing now like a caged animal. "Tombstone Delta 9, that's impossible." He stopped and stared at George, a mixture of fear and disbelief in his eyes. "How can you even know about that?" "Some people are meant to know," George replied. "And I, Colonel Adams, am one of those people." In the minutes that followed, Adams made several more frantic phone calls, each more urgent than the last. George overheard fragments like "base lockdown," "suspend all non-essential operations," and "prepare for arrival of top authority." Outside the interrogation room window, George could see soldiers rushing across the courtyard, military vehicles being repositioned, and what looked like the setup of an improvised landing zone. The entire base was shifting into full emergency mode. "Mr. Dawson," Adams said, his voice now heavy with a respect that had been absent 15 minutes earlier. I need you to understand I was just following protocol. The evidence seemed to—" George raised a hand, silencing him. "You were doing your job, Adams. Poorly, maybe, but still your job." The distant sound of helicopter rotors began to build, growing louder by the second. Adams glanced nervously at his watch, then at the window. "He's coming." George closed his eyes for a moment, mentally preparing for a reunion that hadn't happened in over 2 decades. General Harrison, a man George Dawson had served under with loyalty in more than one operation. The roar of the rotors became deafening as the helicopter touched down in the courtyard. Through the window, George saw a familiar figure step out, grayer than he remembered, but unmistakably Harrison. Adams swallowed hard. "Sir, what am I supposed to tell him?" George opened his eyes and looked straight at the colonel. The truth, Adams. Always tell the truth. The sound of firm footsteps echoed down the hallway, accompanied by a group of high-ranking officers. George Dawson remained seated, his hands clasped on the table, while Colonel Adams stood at attention by the door. The 82-year-old veteran could hear muffled voices outside, orders being given, security protocols being enforced. When the door finally opened, the first person to enter wasn't the general, but a stern-faced major who swept the room with eyes trained to detect threats. Only after his silent approval did an imposing figure step across the threshold. General Harrison had aged, but his presence still commanded any room. The stars on his shoulders gleamed, but it was his reputation that truly demanded respect. "Colonel Adams," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Leave this room immediately. You and all your men. This room is under my sole jurisdiction for the next several minutes." "Yes, sir," Adams replied, practically stumbling over his own tongue. "Is there anything specific you'd like?" "Out." The word was delivered with such finality that Adams left the room as if escaping a fire. The door shut with a definitive click, leaving only George and Harrison in the interrogation room. For nearly a full minute, the two men studied each other in silence. Decades of shared history hung between them like invisible ghosts, missions and decisions that had altered the course of battles. "George Dawson," Harrison finally said, his voice now filled with a familiarity that transcended military rank. 23 years. 23 years and 4 months, George corrected him with a small smile. "But who's counting?" Harrison pulled out a chair and sat on the opposite side of the table, his hands folded in the exact same way as George's. "Tombstone Delta 9, he said plainly. "Still active from what I can tell. More active than you'd think." Harrison leaned in slightly. "George, do you have any idea what kind of storm you stirred up by saying that code?" George let out a deep breath. "I figured it would get someone's attention. I didn't expect a 4-star general to drop in by helicopter." The general opened a folder he had brought with him, revealing documents stamped in red. "Top secret. In the last 6 weeks, someone's been leaking information about Delta operations from the 80s and 90s. Information that only 17 people still alive would know." 17. There were 18 until last week. Colonel Miller had a heart attack in Phoenix. George closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the loss of yet another comrade. Miller was a good man. He was, and now we're 17. Harrison flipped through the documents. Of those 17, 14 are under constant surveillance because of the nature of what they know. 2 are in high-security medical facilities due to advanced dementia. And 1 was quietly fixing his grandson's bicycle this morning, George finished. "Exactly." Harrison studied George's face carefully. Colonel Adams genuinely believed he had found our leak. The evidence, while circumstantial, was strong enough to justify your arrest. He shut the folder abruptly. "But George, you're one of the most decorated soldiers of your generation. A patriot whose loyalty was never questioned in 40 years of service." He paused. "Suspected? Never." The wave of relief that passed through George was almost physical, like a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Then why am I still here?" "Because, George, now that we know you're not the source, we need your help to find out who is." Harrison stood and began pacing the room. "Someone with access to Tombstone-level data is selling our secrets. Someone we know. Someone we trusted." George absorbed the gravity of that. "You want me to help find a traitor among the other 16. "I want more than that," Harrison said, stopping directly in front of him. "I want you to come back." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. George knew exactly what Harrison was asking, a return to the world he had walked away from. "Tom," George said, using the general's first name for the first time in the conversation. "I'm 82 years old. My arthritis kills me every morning." Harrison smiled. "And yet, just minutes ago, you brought an entire military base to its knees with a single phrase. Some things, George, never get old." "If I agree," George said slowly. I want full access. You'd have unrestricted access to the files of all 16 remaining individuals, unlimited resources for the investigation, and my personal protection if things spiral out of control, Harrison replied. George stood up slowly, his joints protesting the motion. He walked over to the window and watched the frantic movement in the base courtyard, soldiers rushing back and forth. There's something else, Harrison continued. The information being leaked, it's not random. There's a pattern. Whoever our traitor is, they're building a specific puzzle, releasing pieces that, when assembled, could expose the entire Delta operations framework. How much time do we have? Weeks, maybe less. The next leak could be the final piece they need. George closed his eyes and, for a moment, allowed himself to remember the young soldier he'd once been. A man who believed that serving his country meant carrying burdens others would never know existed. That man still lived inside his 82-year-old chest, only asleep, not dead. And Colonel Adams, he asked without turning from the window. He'll be reassigned to another base until this operation is over. He's a good officer, but he can't know more than what he's already seen. George finally turned to face his former commander. Tom, if we do this, if we really find the traitor, what happens to him? Harrison's expression hardened. That depends on what information he sold, and to whom. But George, the general paused meaningfully. Some forms of betrayal can't be redeemed. The two men held each other's gaze for a long moment, sharing the unspoken understanding of soldiers who had seen the darkest sides of war and global politics. Some battles were fought in open fields with flags and uniforms. Others took place in dark rooms, between men who would never be given medals for the sacrifices they made. When do we start? George asked. Now, Harrison said, opening the door to the room. General Harrison, George added, I need to stop by my house first. Tell my son I'll be gone for a few weeks. He worries if I don't show up for Sunday dinner. Harrison nodded. You'll be escorted home. They'll wait while you take care of what you need. After that, you'll be taken to a secure facility. No interruptions, full operational support. 40 minutes later, George was back in his yard, staring at his grandson's bicycle, still lying where he'd left it, chain loose, tools scattered on the grass. For a moment, the irony of the situation hit him full force. That morning, he was just a retired grandfather fixing toys. That afternoon, he had become a soldier once again in a war most people would never know existed. His son Mark listened to his explanation. Something about a temporary government consulting assignment, with the typical skepticism of an attorney, but didn't ask many questions. Years of living together had taught Mark that some things about his father's past were better left unspoken. As George packed a simple bag, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had served his country in silence for decades, carrying secrets heavier than any physical burden. He had raised a family, built a quiet life, and found peace in the simplicity of daily routines. But some callings are greater than personal comfort. Some duties transcend age, retirement, or the natural desire to leave the battles to others. George Dawson zipped his bag, hugged his son a little longer than usual, and walked toward the military vehicle waiting for him. The late afternoon sun painted the sky orange and red, colors that reminded him equally of distant battlefield sunsets and peaceful suburban backyards. As he climbed into the car, George took one last look at his house, a symbol of everything he had fought to protect during his career. Families sleeping safely, children playing without fear, a country that remained strong because men and women were willing to carry invisible burdens. The mission awaiting him would be his last. At 82, George Dawson was returning to the shadows, not for glory, not for recognition, but because there was still a war to win. And some wars, he thought as the vehicle pulled away, are simply too important to leave for someone else to fight. The code he had spoken to Colonel Adams had reopened a chapter of George's life he believed was long closed. But perhaps, some books are never truly finished.